So I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Nancy Maisels. I'm the chair of the Israel Cancer Research Fund International Scientific Council, and you'll learn a bit more about ICRF, as we call it, this evening. I'd like to start off by thanking the New Rochelle Beth El Synagogue and Center and Temple Israel of New Rochelle for hosting this event. We're really happy to be here. I was your neighbor just up the road in New Haven for almost 20 years. So it's nice to come back to the East Coast, even virtually. I live in Seattle now. So thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm really pleased that ICRF has this opportunity to tell you about some very exciting recent developments in cancer research taking place in the land of Israel. In order to do that, I'm going to turn the program over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Gary Grad from Chicago. Gary's an oncologist who did his medical training at the University of Chicago, and then he became a partner at Northwest Oncology and Hematology in the Chicago suburbs. He practiced actively for over 26 years, and in addition to his clinical practice, he's consulted for several pharma and biotech companies and for local, regional, and national hospital and healthcare networks. Gary's now working for Tempus Labs, which is a leading biotech company applying AI technology to cancer genomics in order to guide cancer therapy and research. Gary served on the ICRF Chicago board for 5 years and on the International Scientific Council of ISC for 2 years. So you're going to all have a chance to ask questions after Gary talks, and there'll be a green chat box to type questions into. Please save up your questions because we'd love to answer them at the end. And with that message, I'd like to turn things over to Gary. Gary.
Thank you, Nancy. I am going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. Well, there we go. And I think that should be working now. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about Israeli cancer research. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. We will touch a little bit on ICRF, which, as you've heard, Nancy and myself and a few others on the call are very involved with, but we really want to focus on what's unique about cancer research in Israel. And my slide's not advancing. We'll try this. There we go. So I did this talk recently for a large synagogue in Chicago, and I thought I would start with some personal background about my medical background and my Jewish communal background, and the things that resonated for me as I started connecting with the concept of supporting Israeli cancer research and understanding what's unique about it. So I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. As Nancy said, I went to University of Chicago Medical School. I've been in practice. I am retiring next month from my clinical practice and will be devoting my professional time to work with Tempus, as Nancy mentioned. My Jewish communal journey that led me to ICRF and Israeli cancer research in general comes from a few places. I had the pleasure, after being involved in synagogue leadership when I was much younger, when my kids were growing up, and involved in APAC and Federation, to do a Wexner Heritage Foundation fellowship. And it was a life-changing experience for me. And one of the things that I came across there from a teacher was for Torah to be alive, take God out of it and put the story of your own life prism in it and read the Torah in that sense. As I started to do that, there were different phrases that kind of led me to where I'm at now on my journey with ICRF and Israeli cancer research. And I'll share some of those with you. They may or may not mean anything to you, but they mean a lot to me personally. The concept of L'or Goyim, one could write a PhD thesis on the different meanings of this over the years to different groups, secular, religious. But to me, it resonated that there's something about the people of Israel being a light unto the world and unto dark places in the world, to bring light there. The concept of Matovu Halecha always resonated with me, that in the Torah, those words were uttered by someone who came to curse the Israelites and could only look down upon them and say, Matovo halecha Yaakov, how goodly are your tents? And I've always wondered, as we go through a more modern time, what types of things can come out of Israel where those who might want to curse Israel could only look upon Israel and say, Matovu halecha. The concept of the 2.5 tribes, Ruvain, Gad, and half of Manasseh, I've always felt that my soul's birthplace is the land of Israel. And yet I live here in America. And how do I come to grips with that potential conflict? And I look to bearing the legacy of those 2.5 tribes who in the Torah approached Moshe and said, the land's a little bit better for us here for a number of reasons. We're going to stay here, but still want to stay connected to our brethren in the land. And they were given permission to do that to the extent that they were the vanguard of support for their brethren in the land. So I try to get a sense of that legacy in my own personal Jewish communal journey. I was led through a number of avenues to do a little bit of studying of Rav Kook. And one line that always has resonated with me is this line here, Eretz Yisrael einena devar chitzoni. The land of Israel is not a peripheral thing, not a peripheral matter. And though, again, one could write a PhD thesis on that one sentence, there's always something about it that I turn over again and again and means something to me, that there's something unique about the land of Israel and the people there. And as I think about that in the context of Israeli cancer research, hopefully I'll be able to share some of that with you tonight. And then, of course, like a lot of things in the Jewish community, one evening at a Shiva, I happened to be sitting next to the person who was the Chicago executive director for Icrf at the time, and started talking to me at a point in my life where I didn't think I had more room on the dance card. And yet everything she had said to me about what Icrf was and Israeli cancer research was resonated with me. And I felt like I had been brought along that journey for that moment at that Shiva, unfortunately, to meet this person and to become involved with Icrf. And I guess to sum it up best, we recently had an international board meeting, and Rob Denson, who is our outgoing president, had a great line. And it very simply, I think, solidifies what we all feel. We love Israel and we hate cancer. And Rob says things the way that no one else can, very succinctly and to the point. And I think he'll be glad to know that the only two people who I footnoted in this talk were Rav Kook and Rob Denson. So this is my cancer research in a nutshell slide. That is a nutshell up at top. And the main point of this is to really show you, we get a lot of questions from people we talk to about, especially supporters of cancer research, both here and in Israel. Why aren't they coming up with new things quicker? Why, I donated last year, where's the new treatment now? And I just want to make the point that there's a lot of years. You can see the timeline on the far right. That's years and years and years where we go from what we call basic or bench research up to clinical research, or what we call bedside research. And Nancy and Dr. Saf, who are on the call tonight, have a lot of experience. They're academic researchers of the highest quality, and they spend years doing research to identify new treatments and to bring things from this bench to bedside journey. And Dr. Chikanover, who is instrumental in the eventual development of a drug used every day now in treating a disease called multiple myeloma, explains this journey from when he first identified the chemical pathways involved. It took 28 years along that timeline for a drug to come to market. So it's a long process to go from that basic conceptual research to actually treatments that make life better for cancer patients. So that's sort of cancer in a nutshell for right now. It's oversimplified, but I think makes the point that things take a long time to evolve. At least they used to. We'll talk more about that. So why Israeli cancer research? What is different about cancer research in Israel compared to cancer research in New York or Chicago or Boston or California or anywhere else, or Seattle? Sorry, Nancy. And to answer this question, I've spent a lot of time scratching my head about it because I think it's an important point. And I had the pleasure of meeting Ronit Sechi-Finero when she was in Chicago, and we had a chance to have dinner together. And I asked her this question directly. She actually has done research both in academic institutions in the United States, and now is the head of the physiology department at Tel Aviv University and one of the top cancer researchers in Israel. And this is her lab. And she actually had some very specific answers for me. What she taught me was that in the United States, she felt the culture was more geared towards established academic hierarchies. So ideas flowed from a student to a graduate student to a postdoc to junior faculty to senior faculty and research directors. And though there were exceptions and people could be heard, the general culture is that things flowed through a hierarchy. And again, these are her opinions. And in Israel, the culture is such that there's more opportunity for any good idea to flow up the chain very quickly and with much fewer stopgaps. And she thought that led to the potential for more innovative ideas coming through. She also felt that there was a culture that supported shift to tangential ideas. So where she felt in the United States, if you get a grant to study X and you study it, you see it through until you've completed that study. Whereas in Israel, the culture is more that if you start studying X and you come across a tangent Y or a tangent Z, you're almost encouraged to go off on those tangents and explore them if they seem more rewarding from a research standpoint than the original path that you were on. They've also learned in Israel to do more with less. They have less funding. They repurpose supplies. They repurpose equipment. Their labs aren't fancy. And they've learned to be very efficient with their resources. And finally, there's this thing that she almost felt embarrassed to mention to me. She thought she would be insulting me. And maybe it doesn't resonate as much in New York, because I think New York is a unique environment where there is an incredible intellectual density. But she talks about this intellectual density factor, that anywhere you go in Israel, if you're sitting on a beach, if you're sitting in parks, if you're sitting in a restaurant or coffee house, if there's any rabbis on the line, please excuse me, but even during or before or after Minyan, conversations take place with very high intellectual quotient individuals who might be doing things that have value to your research. And everybody's always talking about these things. And, you know, I know at least in my coffee house, there's a lot more talk about reality TV. And, you know, there are these discussions that go on with cross-discipline discussions about how everybody might be able to help everybody else in their research. This is an article that came out of Israel 21C. Israel 21C is a online journal, which if you haven't explored it, I highly encourage you to. My friend Brian Abrahams is now one of the directors of it. And it looks at Israeli life in the 21st century across a whole range of issues. And this was an article that they had relatively recently talking about this concept of bioconvergence as the next big thing emerging from Israel. And the idea that drug development will be driven by a sophisticated overlap of biology, computer science, mathematics, engineering, and nanoscience. And I think the whole idea behind these multidiscipline interactions and convergences is to shrink the timeline, as I have down there on the bottom left, to really kind of take that timeline and shrink it way down. By using computer science combined with a biologist and a mathematician, we can do at-scale machine learning and identify observations that might take much longer to identify. We can develop simulations in a computer or organoids to test drugs at a much faster rate than we could with standard clinical trials. So I think the whole concept of bioconvergence emerging is taking the best that all of these disciplines have to offer, applying them to a problem and really shrinking that timeline. And perhaps the best way to think about it is if I were sitting in Chicago in a Starbucks and I said to someone, a biologist, a computer scientist, a mathematician, 2 engineers, a nanoscientist, and a rabbi were having coffee, they would look at me and they would say, "Nu, what's the punchline?" If I'm sitting in Jerusalem at a coffee house off of Icrf and I said the same thing, they would say, "Nu, what company did they start? Which institution is doing the research and where can I invest?" And it's more of an everyday thing. And I think that kind of really gets the gist of that intellectual density that is fairly unique to that culture in Israel that leads to innovation, not just in cancer care, but across the board in technology and a whole host of other disciplines. Oops. This is an article that was in No Camels. No Camels is another online journal that it's meant for a worldwide audience, and it follows Israeli innovation and technology. And it doesn't just do it for medicine, it does it in a whole bunch of different disciplines. Again, a very interesting online journal to follow if you're not doing it already. And earlier this year, they listed their top 5 recent advances in Israeli cancer research and treatment that they thought were key issues. Some of these folks are ICRF funded researchers, but I'll go through some of these just to kind of at a high level share with you some of the things going on in Israel and that warranted being rated by this journal as one of the top 5 advances. The first one is Professor Yuval Shaked, who studies the resistance to cancer treatment. And where a lot of people study resistance mechanisms in cancer, either due to mutations or things going on within the cell itself, Dr. Shaked at Technion is doing some work with the environment that the cancer cell is in and how that may play a role in contributing to resistance of cancer treatment. So some really interesting things going on there. Alpha DART is using diffusing alpha emitter radiation. Radiation therapy is used often to treat cancer. The problem we have, and it harks back to one of my mentors when I was in training back in the 80s, Dr. Everett Vokes used to say this. He's now the head of American Society of Clinical Oncology and a really world eminent researcher in head and neck cancer. He used to say enough radiation will kill anything. There's no such thing as cancer that's resistant to radiation. The problem is that the radiation doses that it takes to kill a cancer unfortunately kill the normal cells before they would kill the cancer in many cases. And so there's limitations to using those doses of radiation. And so there's always attempts to find better ways of using radiation to treat cancer. And Alpha DART, or this Alpha Tau Medical, is one of the innovations that are looking at using alpha emitter radiation. If we get into pancreatic cancer, especially with germline BRCA mutations, something that we see in Ashkenazi Jewish communities at a higher frequency, Talia Golan was practice changing in the research she published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2019 and presented at our American Society of Clinical Oncology meetings, using a class of drugs called PARP inhibitors in patients with inherited BRCA mutations. We often think of BRCA as being associated with breast and ovarian cancer. We now know that it's associated with several other cancers, including pancreas cancer, prostate cancer. So what she showed is that if you give these PARP inhibitors to patients with a germline BRCA mutation after standard chemotherapy with pancreas cancer, you can significantly prolong the control of the cancer compared to not using these agents. And it was really the first breakthrough therapy in many, many years in pancreas cancer, showing a significant impact on outcome in advanced pancreas cancer. And these patients do live a very, very long time with their disease if they have these germline BRCA mutations and get PARP inhibitors and respond to their initial chemotherapy. Also, Talia Golan working with Malka Cohen-Armon at Tel Aviv University Sheba Medical Center. They're looking at a next generation, if you will, PARP inhibitor called PJ34. And they've had some interesting studies going on with that. And that's another area that they thought was a top advance from this No Camels. So stay tuned for more outcomes information about that. And finally, the last innovation that they highlight here is a DNA repair biomarker score to try to predict lung cancer risk in patients who might be at risk for lung cancer and understand who's really at risk and who's not, and can help guide either early detection, screening mechanisms, and hopefully catch these cancers early. So those are some of the top 5 innovations that were highlighted by No Camels back in February. In the cancer world, February to January, which is 11 months, is a very, very long time. So obviously this will await updating. Things are happening all the time. I highlighted a couple other interesting things coming out of Israel. This first one, CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing, is from Dan Pier's lab. And you can see that's his lab at Tel Aviv University at the Shmuna School of Biomedicine and Cancer Research. And this is really a fascinating therapy. What CRISPR is, it's a way of gene editing. We know cancers are driven by changes in genes, in DNA, and ultimately RNA and expression of proteins. And the types of things that can happen could be mutations, or what we call single nucleotide variants. There can be insertions or deletions where new material is introduced into the DNA or excised from the DNA. There can be fusions where new genes that aren't normally next to each other fuse together. And then finally, there can be what's called copy number changes or copy number variants, where there's a much higher number of a certain gene than should be there. And And all of those things are the drivers of different cancers. So the theory behind CRISPR is, can you find a way to get a, I go back, I'm giving my age away here, whiteout or correction, spell check correction, basically, to the DNA? Can you get something into the cell that can splice out the abnormalities in the DNA that the cancer cell has become addicted to? And that's what CRISPR technology is. There's a lot of technical issues trying to make that happen in terms of how to deliver these gene editing enzymes to the cancer cell, not to the normal cell, prevent antibodies that you might form against these from thinking that this is a foreign invader and eliminating it. And Dan Peer and his group were able to do this in an animal model. And since they've published this, you can see this was published relatively recently, up under the title of the article in Science Advances in November of 2020. Several more animal models have come out and talks about really moving forward with widespread clinical assessment of this in humans. And it's pretty fascinating technology. It's basically a molecular scissors. And that is innovative research coming out of Israel. There's a nice review of this actually in the Harvard article from the, if you go on the Harvard website from the School of Arts and Sciences, they actually have a really nice review of Dan Peer's research. Down below, we can see this concept of using nanovaccines. And this is a really hot topic. This is Ronit, whose picture I showed you earlier. This is her laboratory. And the concept here is, can you do what basically we're doing a lot with a lot of the COVID vaccines now? Can you introduce things in a way where you can get the immune system to recognize a cancer cell as a foreign invader, similar to what we're doing now, and develop an immune response to the peptides or the proteins that are on that cancer? So in COVID, we're doing that with the spike protein now. We're trying to introduce RNA to get our body to recognize that as foreign and develop an immune response to it. And what Ronit is doing is trying to do that with cancer. She's had some really exciting research that shows proof of concept. And it's really incredibly exciting research. She's also adopted her laboratory to help with COVID research at the same time, since it's the same platform that she was able to transition over. And then the final article I have here is this idea of ghost cells. And this is an interesting one because I think it kind of shows a little bit about Israeli perseverance. This was from Marcel Makloff, and her research was somewhat controversial. Some of the bigger journals initially, like Nature and Cell, had rejected publishing her research. More recently, Nature did, Cell still has not. She's gotten some private funding to move forward with it. And what she's doing is she's basically emptying out stem cells of their contents and creating these ghost cells. And the idea behind that is that it's biomimetic, meaning that it's not recognized as foreign because it's biologically similar to normal cells, and yet you can load it up with proteins or peptides or DNA or toxins that you want to bring to a cancer cell, and hopefully get those to go into the cancer cell and not into normal cells. So again, these are all almost science fiction-like in their mindset. I mean, this is incredibly exciting stuff, and yet it's all coming out of Israel, and it's stuff that the world is intrigued and excited by as we move forward. A few other things coming out of Israel. I'm going to refer to our Brilliant Minds series from ICRF. If you're not familiar with this, I recommend you tune in. Several of our oncology and cancer research folks who are associated with ICRF help moderate these, Nancy and Mark Israel and others. And we try to get a patient story in there and a Israeli researcher to go over their research. And there have just been some unbelievably interesting webinars that have been done. These are all saved on the ICRF website, and you can see the link down below. I'll go through these real quick for 2020, and then I'll mention one that's happening tomorrow night. 2020, we had Oren Parnas talking about engineering immune cells to help fight pancreatic cancer. Right now, the standard immune therapies that we have that you see on television ads all the time that we use in melanoma and lung cancer and several other cancers now in general have not been, with a few exceptions, with certain biomarkers that certain pancreatic cancers have not been extremely effective in pancreas cancer. So Professor Parnas is working on trying to engineer the immune cells to better fight the pancreas cancer. Asya Rolls at Technion had a fascinating series about how the mind can affect the biology of the immune response and the immune therapy associated with cancer. And it's sort of this mind-body link, and it's a really interesting webinar. I highly recommend that webinar also. Shai Israeli did a webinar on Towards the Cure for Childhood Cancer. Yossi Shilo talks again, I mentioned radiation earlier, about treating cancer with radiation. One of my favorites is Ravid Straussman from Weizmann, who identified that in cancer cells, there are actually living bacteria. And some of these bacteria are specific for specific types of cancer. Some are bacteria that we've known about and we see in common everyday life. Other are rarer types of bacteria, but that they may actually not just be there incidentally, but may actually play a role in the cancer cells and lead to cancer resistance. And there's some fascinating research that Ravid has done showing in cell models that if these bacteria are there, giving a treatment which should work in a cancer, but has resistance, if you treat with an antibiotic to rid that cell of the cancer, you can get that treatment to work again. And it's a really fascinating, again, out of the box concept that's going to be really interesting to see where that leads to as it continues on. Professor Geva Zatorsky from Technion talks about cancer, immunity, and gut health. And we've known for some time now, since we started using a lot of the immune therapies, that if we alter the gut biome with antibiotics, et cetera, we affect the effectiveness of some of these immune therapies. So if we take a disease where the immune therapies are very effective, and we look at the patients who didn't respond and look for commonality amongst those, or who had less of an effective outcome, one of the things that shook out were patients who had antibiotics initiated around the time of their initiation of these immune therapies. And it may be based on, in fact, there's some research emerging supporting that a lot of that is based on alterations by the antibiotics of the gut microbiome. And so that area of research is going to be fascinating. And can we alter gut health to improve the effectiveness of immune therapy? And then finally, Ronit did one on cancer viruses and the hope of nanoviruses. And we've talked a little bit about those, and it leads into the one for tomorrow night, if you're interested to log on, with Uri Ben David, about targeting cancer with vaccines and new therapies. And I think you'll see some really interesting updates on their research there. So hopefully I've made the point that Israel is a unique culture and environment for innovation, not just in technology and business and other things, but certainly in cancer research. So why ICRF? As you can tell, ICRF has supported a lot of these innovative cancer research. It's hard to completely separate a talk about Israel cancer research and ICRF. But at its core, ICRF fundamentally believes in the unique intellectual, creative, collaborative, and innovative culture of Israel to be optimally positioned to change the world through innovation and disruptive cancer research, thereby improving cancer care for people worldwide. Therefore, ICRF fundamentally believes in the value of funding Israeli scientists in Israel so they can have adequate resources to remain and continue their work at home and not need to seek appointments in Europe or the United States. The funding from ICRF, if you earn an ICRF grant, is institution agnostic. We have a world-class scientific review panel headed by Nancy. Only grants that meet the highest and most stringent levels of scientific rigor and scoring are funded. The funding goes to the researcher and not the institution. Many times in cancer research, a good portion of a grant's funding will go to the supporting institution. Our funding goes to the researcher. Our grants are usually multi-year grants, which allow projects to continue. And this is something I hear again and again from every Israeli researcher that we've spoken to who's received an ICRF grant, from Dr. Chikanover, who's won a Nobel Prize, to new grant recipients. the prestige of an ICRF grant to get additional funding through their career is invaluable. So as these researchers go on and apply for other national fundings, having an ICRF grant is invaluable to their career advancement. I mentioned the scientific review panel. Nancy can certainly talk more about that since she heads it up. It's 40 to 60 world-class scientists who donate their time to review these grants. Over the last 2 years, we have funded over 70 grants a year and about a little over $4 million annually. Most of the grants are 3 years. We have reserves. And so despite COVID-related drops in cancer research support worldwide, we have been able to continue to support ongoing Israeli cancer research because we know cancer does not stop for pandemics. And this is just a high-level snapshot of our grants since inception. We're approaching $80 million of grants given out. You can see on the left column the areas of active grant research right now, the disease states in which active grant recipients are studying, and then the institutions just listed alphabetically, again, highlighting that institution agnostic nature of our grants. I'm not going to get into all of these researchers, but if you go on the website, you can do a much deeper dive into our researchers, what they're doing, a little bit more about their background. And you can also learn more about that ICRF Brilliant Minds webinar series that we mentioned, including tomorrow night's program. So to bring it home, Israeli cancer research, with the help of and support of ICRF and many, many others, is changing the world. We're about to approach Rosh Chodesh Shvat. And as that approaches, like the trees, which we'll celebrate soon for Tu B'Shvat, Israeli cancer research sprouts a healing and inspiring garden of hope for those with cancer and their loved ones around the world. And as we prepare to celebrate, let us also help to continue to plant and cultivate the seeds of Israeli cancer research so we may all share in the miraculous fruits of discovery, innovation, and healing. The answer to cancer is research. And I'll stop there and open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. You really captured the creativity and intensity and the nimbleness of Israeli science. And it may seem tasteless after those adjectives, but it's also really a bargain. They get so much done with so much less than we expect in labs in the States. It's just extraordinary. So I think it's just really quite wonderful that you're able to master so many different things going on in that place. I was quite moved by how you came to this. I remember many years ago, a rabbi said, the Torah is a letter from our ancestors explaining to us how they saw the world, which I thought was quite moving. And what you're doing is writing the correspondence back. And it must be very fulfilling for you. And I'd love to have some questions about ICRF and the science, but if you could elaborate on that a little, I think it would be wonderful.
Sure. I think it's taken me to this point where I feel very fulfilled because it helped me understand what my destiny was. People always ask me why I became an oncologist. How did I choose oncology? I have a daughter who's going through medical school now and fretting over which discipline to pursue. She's a third-year student, halfway through her third year. And I always said oncology chose me. It's kind of like the sorting hat from Harry Potter. And there is, and I think you relate to that. Those of us who get involved in it understand that there's something in it that draws us to it. And part of it is that pastoral journey that we get to take with our patients. I use the Torah as a paradigm for the healing journey of my patients. And I've learned a lot from that. And just at a very quick level, I'll explain that. If you look at the journey of the Israelites from Egypt, when they're in Egypt and slaves, they're burdened by physical despair. And Moses comes to them and they're not ready for a spiritual message. And that's something I always remembered with my patients as I started, using the Torah as this paradigm for me, that my patients who are in great pain aren't ready to hear an emotional or spiritual message from me yet. So first we have to relieve the physical suffering. The Israelites then leave and they're standing at the sea and they've got the Egyptians behind them. They're facing a sea of unknown in front of them. They're fearing mortality. And I think that relates very nicely to what cancer patients go through on their journey, that fear of the unknown, those emotions of what do you do? Do you take that step forward and cross into that sea of cancer therapy, immune therapy, or do you get paralyzed by it? And then
So,
finally, go ahead.
oh, so I understand we have a question, but I'm not able
Oh,
to
good.
see it. Could the person with the question unmute their microphone and talk?
Oh,
Or can you see it on the?
I can see it. Yeah, I can see it.
Great.
The question is, can the COVID vaccine potentially help with fighting any types of cancer? I mentioned so many pivoted their research, so how could it be helpful? So Nancy and Gerald may have more insight on this as academics, but my take on it is that the technology of the vaccine, of using RNA from the virus to induce the body to form an immune reaction against a protein on the virus, is exactly what a lot of the cancer research that Ronit and others doing nanotechnology are doing, whether it's RNA or peptides from a cancer cell that's unique to the cancer cell, to try to induce the immune system to recognize that as foreign and form both antibodies and what we call cellular immunity against those cells. Now, it's more complicated than that. Cancer cells have the ability very effectively to hide from the immune system. And a lot of the work that was done that led to the Nobel Prize in Medicine with immune therapy is about trying to block the ability of cancer cells to hide from the immune system. And once we unblock that, we do see the immune system's ability to attack cancer cells. But this is trying to actually induce an immune response. And I recommend tuning in tomorrow, because that webinar will go over that quite a bit, exact point, cancer viruses and vaccines.
So I think one of the amazing things to everyone is that we, the whole biomedical community, was able to develop a vaccine in under a year. And I know it seems slow for those of us who've lived through this last year, but it's remarkably fast on the scale of any other advancement. And I think that ability can quickly translate to vaccines against different cancer targets. And since the platform can be very, very quickly changed, it's just remarkable how adaptable it is. We'll see a lot more cancer vaccines in trials. And of course, you could never have done an experiment with this many people with cancer. It's been a curse that so many people were infected, but it's also enabled us to learn a great deal. So I think you're completely right about the platforms being one of the great things to come out of it.
Nancy, if I can chime in to
Yeah.
follow up on that message, it reminds me of the expression, it took me 40 years to have some beginner's luck. And
I love it.
And the science, just think about what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
From the regulation of the immune system, which is, we've always thought immunity was interesting and antibody generations was interesting and all this stuff. But the technology that won the Nobel Prize in Medicine only a little over a year ago on immunotherapy, and the ability to create artificial RNA, and the ability to know what the target would be, all of these things have been in the pipeline for many years, so that when the need came for the COVID vaccine, all the tools and the expertise and the infrastructure was already there. And this could never have happened 10 years ago, unimaginable 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And yet in 2020, as you said, from knowing there was some strange virus coming out of China to having a vaccine to immunize the world was literally in less than 1 year. That was not 1 year. That was 1 year on top of a generation of science.
That's a really important point. And I think it's important to realize people have been working on cancer from many different angles for quite a long time. And they've made a lot of success considering what a complicated problem it is. And in a year, we could have just an amazing breakthrough. All sorts of amazing breakthroughs are possible. And I feel lucky to be in a position to be able to see some of them coming maybe a few months off as we fund these wonderful Icrf grants and see how these fabulous investigators put our money to great use. So are there other questions? Jerry, do you have anything else to add? I thought that was great.
Last summer I had the chance to do a Zoom conversation with Dr. Chikanover about his work. And Gary, you don't know this, but I personally benefited from his breakthrough, and he and Dr. Hershko, the team of them, in that I had myeloma, and those, I don't know if anybody from Young Israel is on the call, but I'm not private about this. I had myeloma almost exactly 5.5 years ago. And, if I had had that diagnosis 10 years before I did, I wouldn't be here.
No.
But the fact that
Right.
these two fantastic people, as well as brilliant Israeli scientists, discovered the proteasome and led to the drugs, as you commented on, is why I'm here. So we all have to continue to support great research in Israel, not just because but we have to support it because we recognize the fact that we're paying it forward, so that the next time something like this happens to somebody who has a less treatable cancer, they will then look back and say, yes, if I had been diagnosed 5 years before I wouldn't be here. But now, because of the great research that's come out of Israel and other labs, I am here. I'm not sure if I'm saying that eloquently, but the key point is we owe it to ourselves, to our families, to our neighbors, to the world, and to the future to support the kind of research that will continue to lead to breakthroughs. I'm one of these people who says there's not going to be a cure for cancer. There will be many cures for many cancers. And we need to understand the biology. We have to understand the science, so we understand how to apply the biology and the science for the many types of cancers that we're constantly dealing with.
Yeah, you couldn't have put it any better, Jerry, nor could it have been more heartfelt. So that was actually great. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Looks like there is another question.
Okay.
Are you finding that researchers prefer to remain in Israel to pursue their research? That's a great question. Israeli researchers also need to feed their families, and they need to advance their research and support their research. So if all things were equal and funding was widely available, most of the Israeli research I talk to would like to remain in Israel because of all those cultural advantages, amongst other personal reasons. The reality is they have to go to some degree where the funding is. So if there's not enough funding in Israel for them to support their research, and there are opportunities in Europe or the United States, then they may have to go in those directions to fulfill their professional destinies. But if all things were equal and funding was unlimited, what I find is that most of them would like to stay in Israel. And if they can go back to Israel, they often do go back to Israel if they can solidify that long-term funding.
I think the extraordinary job Israel's done with immunization against corona illustrates one of the great things about being in Israel, that people's health is taken care of and people are conscious of it. And it's something that everybody has become very proud of. It's really been an example for the entire world. And that healthcare system provides information for the studies in a lot of the Israeli labs doing cancer research. They have samples that are well documented. They have families that are willing to come in and provide genetic information. People tend to trust physicians and they participate in tests very willingly. And the population is extremely diverse. So you can do a lot of great work in a relatively small country that's applicable at most other places in the world.
There's one more question from Jane about some of my personal remarks earlier, which quite honestly, I don't want to make this about me. I'm certainly not someone who should be giving any kind of a Devar Torah. I'm not qualified for that, but I'm happy to touch base offline and share some of my personal reflections about how I frame the cancer journey for my patients in a spiritual way. And Jane, I'm happy to, someone can share my email and that we can touch base offline and talk more about that.
Yeah, Jane, you also might like to listen to the webinar by Asya Rolls that Gary spoke briefly about. Asya's became very interested in what's called the placebo effect. If you treat someone with a sugar pill, 30% of the time it has as much effect as if you give them some known and established drug. And she's actually doing very concrete and mechanistic experiments showing that by treating something, you initiate emotions in your brain that can activate the immune response, and that in turn is curative. It almost sounds like magic or science fiction the way I'm describing it, but when she talks about it, you'll see that there's a really strong and compelling reality. And that was our webinar in October, and it's quite delightful to listen to. There was actually a woman from Chicago who had breast cancer who gave the introduction to that. And she was fascinating to listen to about how she wrote messages on the mirror to give herself encouragement day to day. So I recommend that highly if this is something you're interested in.
Yeah,
So we're,
go ahead.
go
Nancy.
ahead.
I can say, I see a question here. Bruce Gold asked, another thought is on the contributions of Israeli researchers is the impact it's having on saving lives across the globe. Is there growing recognition of this worldwide? And I would say absolutely yes. I was reading an article and I can't remember, it was Jerusalem Post or one of the Jewish Israeli newspapers. And they were saying really in the last year or two, there's been a fundamental shift in the perception of Israel around the world. You know, those of us who are been, Zionists and supportive of Israel, you know, we've always been there type of thing. But all of a sudden, Arab countries, third world countries, China, all these countries begin to recognize like, what's going on here? Why is this small country, I think Israel just hit 9 million people. How is this small country accomplishing so much? How is this small country leading the world in vaccination penetration? How is this small country accumulating such brilliant advances? How is this small country technology, medical research, all of a sudden now, rather than Israelis having to be defensive and Israelis having to be hidden about their identity, they're being sought out because there is a recognition that what Israel is putting out there is indeed helping the world. For generations, they've had to fight very hostile, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionistic propaganda. But that's really changed. And I think the change is happening not just for, they're the toughest guy on the block, but because they're also the most compassionate. They're also the most giving. They're also the most scientifically innovative. And what Israel can produce is indeed changing the world way beyond its numbers.
So I think that's something very inspiring. And if there are no more questions, that might be a good place to end this. I'm really grateful to so many people who've tuned in this evening. And I'd love to meet all of you in person. I'd love to meet almost anybody in person right now, but I especially like to have a chance to meet all of you. And I want to really thank Jerry and also Gary, especially. I've learned so many things. I wrote down No Camels and Israel 21C. I'm going to look them up as soon as I'm offline. So thank you for those great hints of things to learn about. And I hope everyone who's been here has a good rest of their evening. And please take care, stay safe. The vaccine is just around the corner and we'll have better times in the future. Thank you very much.
Good night.